In the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, a family vanished, one by one without a trace. For years their disappearance remained a chilling mystery, until now. What if I told you the land itself is hiding the truth, and the souls of the lost are still waiting for their release? Join me as we unravel a terrifying curse buried deep in the heart of the forest, where the land doesn't just claim lives, it traps them forever. The morning fog hung thick in the Appalachian Mountains, curling through the trees like an ancient breath of the earth itself. It was a slow, lingering kind of fog, one that clung to the earth even after the sun had risen, casting the woods in an otherworldly light. The towering pines and oaks loomed like sentinels over the Harrison farm, standing as old witnesses to a life that had been lived for generations in this remote corner of the world. The land was beautiful, wild, and at times unnervingly quiet. Jonah Harrison had always loved it here, the peace of the land, the rhythm of the seasons, the simplicity of life. His rugged hands, worn from years of working the soil, felt the earth in ways that few others did. He understood the land's moods, the way it breathed, how it whispered secrets on the wind, how the very soil could tell you when a storm was coming, or when the animals were preparing for winter. His father had taught him this, and his father before him. It was a family tradition that stretched back more than a century. Jonah's wife, Maggie, often marveled at how in tune he was with the land. To her, the mountains were beautiful but forbidding, always holding something just out of sight, something that had kept her on edge since she was a young girl. She loved Jonah deeply, but she often found herself in the quiet moments, listening to the wind, wondering if the mountains were hiding something they couldn't understand. Their home, a small log cabin nestled deep in the hills, was a testament to their hard work. Maggie kept a warm, inviting hearth where the children could gather around, and Jonah would often sit in his rocking chair by the fire, his rough hands resting on his lap, watching the flames dance. Their 3 children, Eliza, the eldest at 18, Tommy, the adventurous 15-year-old, and Sophie, the youngest at 10, had grown up with the mountains as their playground. Their days were filled with chores, laughter, and the occasional adventure through the thick woods. Though their life was humble, it was filled with purpose. There was a peace in the routine of it all, a comfort in knowing that tomorrow would be much like today. But even in the heart of that peace, there was always an underlying tension, something unspoken that sat like a shadow in the corner of their home. Maybe it was Maggie's uneasy feeling about the land, or the stories she'd heard as a girl about spirits and curses that wandered the hills. Jonah dismissed these stories, but Maggie couldn't forget the unease they stirred in her. The Harrison family had lived in the mountains for as long as anyone could remember, but there were stories that ran through the veins of the land, old stories of families that vanished, of children that disappeared without a trace. Jonah would laugh them off as local superstition, and Maggie would nod along, but she always felt a shiver when she stood at the edge of the woods at dusk, listening to the wind whistling through the trees. On that early morning in late spring, when the sun had only just begun to climb over the horizon, the last thing Maggie expected was that this would be the day everything changed. The air outside was crisp and fresh, the scent of pine and earth heavy in the atmosphere. Maggie was already up, as she usually was, preparing breakfast in the kitchen. The wood stove crackled softly, the faint smell of hot cornbread mixing with the scent of fresh coffee. She glanced out the window, the glass misted with dew, and saw the first light of the day spilling over the mountainside, casting long shadows across the land. Jonah had gone to bed the night before with the usual exhaustion of a day spent working the land. He'd spent hours clearing out the field for the new planting season. But by morning, when Maggie went to call him for breakfast, he was nowhere to be found. At first she thought nothing of it. Jonah was often an early riser, heading out to check the traps or tend to the animals before the sun fully rose. But when she went outside and called his name, the quiet of the morning felt wrong. It wasn't just the absence of Jonah's voice, there was something unsettling in the air. The woods, usually alive with birdsong, were eerily silent. No wind rustled the branches. No animal stirred in the underbrush. Only the soft whispers of the fog as it rolled across the ground. Maggie? Eliza's voice broke through her thoughts. Her daughter stood at the door, her brow furrowed with concern. "Where's Dad?" "I don't know," Maggie said, trying to sound calm, though her voice betrayed her anxiety. "He's probably out in the field or in the woods. You know how he is." Eliza nodded, but Maggie could see the doubt in her eyes. Eliza, though strong, had always been more sensitive than Jonah, more attuned to the subtle shifts in the world around them. She often shared Maggie's unease about the land, though she never spoke of it aloud. Eliza was like her mother in that way, quietly intuitive, always sensing things before they happened. Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, calling for Jonah once again, but there was no response. She walked toward the edge of the woods, scanning the trees, her eyes darting over the familiar landscape. There was no sign of Jonah, no tracks in the dirt, no signs of movement. The world felt wrong, as if something had shifted overnight, something that wasn't immediately visible but could be felt in the very air they breathed. The tension in Maggie's chest grew. She called to Eliza and Tommy, who had joined her outside now. "We need to check the traps, see if he's out there. Tommy, go with your sister to the field. I'll check the barn." As Tommy and Eliza moved toward the field, Maggie made her way toward the barn. It was a small, creaky structure built to store tools, feed, and whatever else they needed to keep the farm running. She hesitated before opening the door, sensing that something was off. When she stepped inside, the barn was dark, silent, and still. The hay smelled musty and the floorboards creaked beneath her feet. She walked toward the back where Jonah often kept his tools, but there was no sign of him. The horses were all accounted for, quietly chewing hay in their stalls, oblivious to the growing sense of dread that Maggie couldn't shake. Maggie's mind raced. Jonah was never this late. She stepped back into the cold light of morning, feeling the weight of the land on her shoulders. Every tree, every stone seemed to be watching her, as if the mountains themselves knew what was coming. Just then Eliza's voice called out from the field, "Mom, you need to come look at this." Maggie's heart skipped. Her feet carried her toward the sound of Eliza's voice, her mind too frantic to reason through the growing panic. Eliza was standing near the creek that ran through the farm, a hand on her hip, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Look," she said, pointing to the ground. At first Maggie didn't see it, but as she bent down and followed the path Eliza was indicating, her breath caught in her throat. There, in the mud near the creek, were two sets of footprints, Jonah's boots clearly visible, but they stopped abruptly. It was as though he had simply vanished, the footprints disappearing into the soft earth, no further signs of movement beyond. Maggie stood in silence, her pulse hammering in her chest. She looked around, expecting Jonah to step out from behind a tree, to call out with that calm, steady voice of his, telling her it was nothing, that she was overreacting. But Jonah didn't appear. And the more Maggie stared at the prints, the more she realized something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. The land had taken him. The following days were a blur of uncertainty and growing fear. The search for Jonah Harrison had expanded far beyond the borders of their small farm. By midday, the local sheriff, Sheriff Henry Caldwell, had gathered a few neighbors to help search the woods, hoping to find any trace of Jonah. But the deeper they ventured into the woods, the more unsettling it became. The trail they had found by the creek led to nowhere, no sign of a struggle, no tracks that would indicate he had wandered off. Maggie remained at the farmhouse, her every waking moment consumed with a gnawing sense of dread. She felt like a stranger in her own home now, as though something invisible was watching, waiting. The familiar creak of the floorboards under her feet, the comforting smells of the hearth, the quiet hum of the evening, all of it felt different. The land had always been her refuge, the source of her family's livelihood, but now it seemed like something else entirely. The mountains loomed in the distance, dark and silent, as though they were hiding something in their depths. Sophie clung to her mother's side, her wide, fearful eyes never leaving the window, as if expecting to see her father walk up the dirt path at any moment. Eliza was trying to keep things together, organizing meals and attempting to stay strong, but Maggie could see the weight of worry in her daughter's eyes. She was trying to protect her younger siblings, but the strain was too much for even Eliza to bear. The sheriff had promised to keep searching, but as the hours stretched into days, Maggie knew that something was terribly wrong. Jonah never went missing. Not like this. Not without a trace. On the third morning since Jonah's disappearance, David Whitfield, a seasoned tracker from the neighboring town, arrived at the farmhouse. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a gruff demeanor that was softened only by the kindness in his eyes. David had been raised in the same mountain ranges that the Harrisons called home, and he knew the woods better than anyone. "Sheriff Caldwell says you found nothing," David said, his gravelly voice carrying a tone of concern. He didn't need to ask how Maggie was holding up. Her worn face, her tired eyes told the story better than words ever could. No sign of him. Not a single footprint beyond the creek. "Nothing to explain where he went," Maggie replied, her voice tinged with frustration. David nodded, his brow furrowing in thought. He had seen disappearances in the mountains before, but this wasn't like the others. The usual explanations, an animal attack, a fall, a wandering traveler, didn't fit. There was something here, something that went beyond the ordinary. "I'll help you look," David said, his gaze sweeping over the land that Maggie had grown up on, the land that had once felt like it belonged to them. "We'll search the woods together. Maybe there's something we've missed." The group set off into the woods with David leading the way. The dense undergrowth of the Appalachian forest was difficult to navigate, but David moved with ease, as if he knew the land's every hidden path. Maggie and Eliza followed closely behind, though Maggie's heart felt like it was beating out of her chest. The further they walked, the deeper the feeling of unease settled within her. The trees seemed to grow taller, the shadows longer, the air heavier. The fog that had started in the morning had only thickened, turning the forest into a realm of ghosts and secrets. David, you're sure he could have gone this far? Maggie asked, her voice shaky but determined. David paused, looking over his shoulder at her. I've seen men wander off into the woods and never come back, but they always leave something behind. A trace. A sign that they're still out there. But as they ventured deeper, there was nothing. No trace of Jonah, no broken branches, no disturbed earth. The forest had swallowed him whole. By the time the sun began to set, casting a dim orange glow over the mountains, David stopped. His expression was grave. There's something wrong here, Maggie. I can't explain it, but it's like the woods are hiding something from us. It's not just the weather or the land, it's as if something is pulling people in. Maggie felt a chill run down her spine at his words. She had always felt the land was alive, but she had never thought of it in such an ominous way. Was it possible? Could something darker than just nature itself be hiding in the mountains? David, please, where is he? Where's Jonah? Her voice broke, and for a moment she felt as though the weight of the world was pressing down on her. David hesitated, glancing at the forest, as if considering whether to say what was on his mind. They're old stories, Maggie. Stories that go way back. About the mountain and what it takes. Maggie looked at him, confused. Stories? What are you talking about? David lowered his voice, his tone almost a whisper. The old-timers used to tell tales about the woods. About people who disappear without a trace. Some say it's the spirits of the mountains. Others say it's something far worse. Maggie shook her head, refusing to let the dread seep further into her mind. Superstitions. We don't believe in those things, David. But deep down, Maggie couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that had been growing ever since Jonah had gone missing. The unsettling sense that something more than just a simple disappearance was at play. The sheriff had grown more frustrated, and with each passing day, he grew more certain that Jonah had simply run off. Maybe he's hiding out somewhere, trying to get away from it all, he suggested one evening when Maggie confronted him. Maybe he's gone off to clear his head. You know how Jonah is. Maggie didn't know how Jonah was anymore. He had been her rock, her steady partner for so long, and now he felt like a stranger. She shook her head at the sheriff's words. No, something's wrong. He wouldn't just leave like this. Not without a word. The search continued for another few days, but as the days wore on, the initial hope that Jonah would be found alive began to fade. Even the town, which had once rallied to the cause, began to fall silent. People went about their daily lives, leaving the Harrisons to deal with their grief alone. The mountain had claimed Jonah, and it seemed that no one could stop it. Maggie could feel the weight of the silence settling over her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. She spent her nights staring into the empty, blackened corners of their house, waiting for Jonah's voice to break the silence. It never came. Eliza, always strong, finally spoke up one evening after dinner. Her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. Mom, I need to know what happened. What's going on? We've been searching for days and we haven't found anything. Why does everyone think he's gone? Maggie looked at her daughter, the words she had been trying to suppress all this time bubbling to the surface. I don't know, Eliza. I don't know what happened. But there's something in these woods, something we can't explain. And I'm afraid that if we don't find Jonah soon, it might be too late. Eliza was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on her mother's face. Then she nodded. We're not giving up, are we? No, Maggie replied firmly. We're not giving up. But even as she said the words, Maggie knew deep in her heart that something darker than any of them realized was lurking in the shadows. And it was waiting. The days following Jonah's disappearance passed in a haze, each one stretching into the next, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. Maggie barely slept, haunted by dreams of shadows moving just beyond the edge of her vision, of Jonah's voice calling out to her from the fog that seemed to settle deeper each night. Sophie, too young to fully understand, still woke in the middle of the night, calling out for her father, her small voice filled with confusion and longing. Maggie would pull her close, whispering reassurances, but even she wasn't sure what to say anymore. Eliza, on the other hand, had become the rock of the family. Though her face was pale with exhaustion, her shoulders were squared with determination. She spent the days scouring the woods with David Whitfield, retracing their steps from the search the previous week, looking for something, anything, that could lead them to Jonah. They had found nothing. No tracks, no footprints, not a single item belonging to him. As if he had been erased from existence. David had begun to grow more restless too, his demeanor shifting from the steady, reliable man Maggie had always known to someone consumed by an unsettling sense of urgency. He spoke less of the search now and more of the old legends, stories he had dismissed in his youth but now couldn't shake. There are places in these woods, David had said, his voice quiet and strained, that people don't go, places where the earth itself seems to swallow you up, like the land is hiding something. It's always been this way, but it's not just the stories, Maggie. Something in these mountains, it's alive, and it's been waiting for the right time. Maggie's heart twisted at his words. She had heard these stories before, tales of cursed land, of people vanishing without a trace, of strange happenings in the deep woods. But she had always dismissed them as local superstition, things meant to scare children into staying close to home. Now, David's voice was laced with a fear that made her skin crawl. On the 5th day of their search, something changed. David had brought an old map of the area, one that had been passed down in his family for generations. The edges were frayed and the ink was faded with time, but the markings on it were clear. David unrolled the map on the kitchen table, his finger tracing a path that led deeper into the forest than they had ventured before. Jonah was last seen near this spot, David explained, his eyes narrowing. But if he went this way, he traced a finger along a line that led to a part of the woods Maggie had always been warned to stay away from. Maggie leaned over the map, her brow furrowing. I've never seen this part of the land marked before. David nodded slowly. That's because no one goes there. It's called the Hollow. It's a place with a long history, Maggie. There are rumors about things that happen to people who wander too far into those woods. No one's ever come back the same. And there's a reason why this part of the map is so worn. It's not something we talk about. Maggie felt a chill run through her at the mention of the Hollow. She had heard whispers about it growing up, but the stories were always told in hushed tones. Stories about people who had disappeared in that part of the woods, of things that walked under the cover of darkness, waiting for the lost and the broken. I'm going with you, Maggie said firmly, looking up at David. If Jonah went that way, I need to know what happened. David hesitated, his eyes scanning her face. Maggie, this isn't something you want to face. It's dangerous. No one who's gone into the Hollow has come back without something being changed. I don't care, Maggie said, her voice steady. Jonah is out there. I need to find him. And if you won't go with me, I'll go alone. David's expression softened, but there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes. He didn't want to say it aloud, but the fear he had been hiding was evident. The Hollow was no ordinary part of the forest. It was the land's secret, and secrets, Maggie knew, had a way of trapping people in ways that no one could fully understand until it was too late. As dusk fell on the 6th evening since Jonah's disappearance, the group, Maggie, Eliza, David, and Tommy, stood at the edge of the Hollow. The trees here were different, older, taller, their bark twisted and knotted like gnarled hands reaching out from the earth. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds sang. No wind rustled the leaves. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. David stopped at the edge, his eyes scanning the shadowy depths of the Hollow. We'll go in slow, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Stay close. Don't let the woods pull you in. Eliza nodded, gripping the rifle her father had used to hunt. Tommy, though nervous, was determined to find his father. Maggie could feel her pulse quicken as she stepped into the forest, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her like a heavy fog. The further they ventured into the Hollow, the stranger the air felt. The shadows seemed deeper here, more oppressive, and every step forward felt like they were being watched. Maggie could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The usual sounds of the woods were missing, the chirp of insects, the call of birds, even the rustle of leaves in the wind. All that remained was the eerie silence, as though the land itself was holding its breath. David led the way, his eyes darting nervously from tree to tree. Stay sharp, he murmured. This place isn't like the rest of the forest. It's different. Eliza looked around nervously, her hand tightening around the rifle. Why does it feel like we're being hunted? David didn't answer immediately. He just continued walking, his gaze fixed on the dense underbrush ahead. The air felt heavy here, as if the very ground they walked on was alive, waiting for them to make the wrong move. Tommy suddenly stopped, his eyes wide with fear. Mom, look. He pointed ahead, his voice trembling. Maggie followed his finger, her breath catching in her throat. In the distance, barely visible through the thick trees, was a faint figure. It was too far to make out clearly, but the outline of a person stood still in the gloom, facing away from them. Maggie's heart skipped. Jonah? No, it couldn't be. It was too far for her to tell, but the figure didn't move, didn't react to their presence. Maggie, don't go any closer, David warned, his voice low and urgent, but it was too late. Maggie's feet carried her forward, her body moving as if it were being drawn toward the figure. It was only when she reached the spot where the figure had been standing that the ground beneath her shifted. The figure was gone. The silence in the Hollow seemed to stretch forever. Maggie stood there, her chest tight, heart pounding. The figure, the one she had thought was Jonah, had vanished without a trace, as if the forest itself had swallowed him whole. She felt a cold wave of dread wash over her, but she refused to turn back. She had come too far. Whatever was out there, whatever had taken Jonah, was not going to slip away unnoticed. David's voice was strained when he spoke. his words clipped. "We need to go. Now." Maggie ignored him, her eyes scanning the dense trees. The shadows here were thicker, darker, like something was lurking just out of sight. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She didn't feel alone anymore. She felt watched, surrounded. "Eliza, Tommy, stay close," Maggie ordered, her voice low but firm. "We're not leaving without answers." Tommy, his small face pale with fear, nodded, but even he could see the growing tension in Maggie. Eliza, standing beside her, gripped the rifle tighter, her eyes darting around in search of any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence that hung heavily in the air. David's unease was palpable now. He turned, glancing behind him, his eyes constantly flicking over his shoulder. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered as if speaking to himself. "This isn't right. The land, it's not like it used to be." Maggie felt her stomach tighten at his words. The hollow had always been a place of fear, a place of mystery, but now it felt alive with something dark and ancient. As they pushed deeper into the woods, the path became even more difficult, the underbrush thick and tangled, as if the forest itself was trying to keep them from going forward. The further they walked, the harder it became to ignore the sensation that they were not just walking through the woods, they were walking into something far older, something that had waited for them. And then, just as Maggie was about to ask David what he meant by the land, a loud, bone-chilling sound cut through the air. It was a howl, long and drawn out, a sound that came from deep in the woods, beyond where they had ventured. It wasn't an animal's cry, not the howl of a wolf or the screech of a mountain lion. It was something more primal, something older, a noise that sent a shock of cold through Maggie's veins. "What was that?" Eliza whispered, her voice trembling. David didn't answer. He just motioned for them to stay quiet. They all stood there for a moment, listening as the howl faded into the distance. There was nothing but the eerie, suffocating silence afterward, the kind that made the hairs on the back of Maggie's neck prickle. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. "I don't think it's wise to go any further," David finally said, his voice tight with concern. "That sound, it wasn't just any animal. We need to turn back." Maggie didn't hear him. She was staring ahead, her eyes focused on something through the trees, something out of place, something she hadn't noticed until now. There, partially hidden behind the thick trunks of the trees, was a faint glimmer, a strange metallic shine that caught the dying light of the sun. "Eliza," Maggie whispered, barely able to control her breath. "Do you see that?" Eliza squinted, her eyes narrowing. "It's just a reflection, Mom. Maybe it's a rock or—" But Maggie was already moving forward, her feet carrying her toward the glimmer without hesitation. Eliza's voice rose in protest, but Maggie didn't stop. There was something pulling her forward, a magnetic force she couldn't explain. The further she moved toward the reflection, the more she felt the oppressive weight of the forest pressing in around her, suffocating her, like the land itself didn't want her to find whatever lay ahead. They reached the source of the glimmer, and what they found sent a cold shiver through Maggie's body. It was an old, rusted chain, a thick metal chain half buried in the leaves with a lock hanging from it. The lock was massive, covered in grime, its surface pitted with rust. But the chain, Maggie could tell, had been placed there deliberately, not by nature, not by the forest, but by someone. It was out of place in this ancient forest, a piece of human history, worn by time but unmistakable. David reached for the chain cautiously, his fingers brushing over the lock, his face twisted with a grim understanding. "This isn't just a coincidence," he muttered, almost to himself. "This is where it all started. This is where they keep them." Maggie turned to him sharply. "What do you mean? Who keeps them?" David's eyes met hers, and for the first time since they had entered the hollow, there was a deep fear in them, a fear that Maggie could no longer ignore. "The family," he said quietly, his voice strained. "The people who disappeared long before us. They're buried in these woods. All of them." The words hit Maggie like a punch to the stomach. She felt her world tilt on its axis, the ground beneath her feet becoming unsteady. "No," Maggie whispered, shaking her head. "That's impossible. Jonah, he can't." But David was already kneeling down, his hands moving to clear away the leaves. As he did, he revealed what lay beneath the chain. It was a wooden box, weathered and cracked with age. But there was no mistaking its significance. This was a coffin, buried under the chain, hidden beneath layers of soil and leaves. It wasn't just a box, it was the final resting place of someone long forgotten. David's face paled as he carefully opened the box, his hands shaking slightly. Inside was a tattered cloth, faded by time, and beneath it, a collection of old items, personal belongings that didn't belong to any of them. There was a photograph, yellowed with age, of a family, 2 parents, a boy and a girl. The faces were smudged, blurred by the years, but there was no mistaking the sense of tragedy that hung over the image. The boy's face was familiar, too familiar. Maggie gasped, her heart sinking. "That's Jonah's family." That's. David nodded grimly. The Harrison family. They vanished here long before you came to this land. It's why no one goes near the hollow. They were taken by something. Something that lives in these woods. And now, he didn't finish the sentence. Maggie didn't need him to. The truth hung heavy in the air, thick with dread. Jonah hadn't been lost to an accident or an illness. He had been taken, just like the others before him. And now it was clear. Jonah wasn't just missing. He was part of something far older, far darker than she had ever imagined. The ground beneath Maggie's feet seemed to shift, and for the first time in her life she felt the mountains closing in around her, the land turning against her. The hollow was not just a place in the woods. It was a place where souls were lost, where families vanished, where the land itself kept them locked away. "Mom?" Eliza's voice broke through her thoughts, trembling with fear. Maggie looked up at her daughter, who stood behind her, her face pale with terror. Eliza's voice quivered. "What do we do now?" Maggie didn't have an answer. She could only look at the coffin in front of her, the items buried inside, the photograph of a family lost to time. And somewhere deep in the forest, something waited for them. Something that had never let go of its victims, and something that would never let go of them either. The discovery of the coffin had shattered the fragile thread of hope Maggie had been clinging to. She stood there, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her chest like a stone. The photograph of the Harrison family, Jonah's ancestors long lost to the shadows of time, lay in her trembling hands. The chain had been no mere relic of the past. It was a warning, a barrier that had kept whatever force lurked in the hollow from claiming more souls. Maggie's mind raced as she turned away from the coffin, her eyes darting to Eliza, whose face had gone ashen. The silence in the woods was deafening, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. The land had always felt like a living thing, something that had quietly watched them, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. And now that moment had come. "Eliza." "Tommy, stay close," Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible as if the forest itself might hear them. "We're leaving. We need to go home." David stood beside her, his own expression clouded with the weight of the truth. "This place, it's not just a cursed spot. It's a prison. A place where the land keeps its secrets buried. Jonah, he's part of it now. He's gone but—" Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she finished the sentence for him, her voice trembling with the terror she felt but couldn't escape. "But he's still here, trapped in the woods, just like the others." David nodded solemnly, his eyes drifting toward the darkening tree-line. "The hollow doesn't let go, Maggie. It keeps its victims. And sometimes, when you wander too close to the heart of it, you become part of the land." A wave of cold fear swept over Maggie, as if the very earth beneath her was closing in. But she couldn't linger here, not anymore. She had to get her children to safety. She had to get them away from whatever it was that had taken Jonah, whatever it was that lurked in the dark heart of these woods. The group began their slow retreat, stepping away from the eerie confines of the hollow, but Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, that the forest itself was alive with anticipation. Every crack of a twig beneath their feet seemed too loud, too deliberate, as if something was tracking their every movement. The shadows lengthened, the darkness in the woods growing deeper, more impenetrable. As they made their way back to the clearing, the sun had already dipped behind the mountains, and the sky had turned a deep shade of purple, heavy with impending storm clouds. The wind began to pick up, rustling the trees with a sound that seemed almost like whispers, carried on the breeze. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to keep moving, to stay focused. Eliza, walking beside her, was quiet, her face pale and tense. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her rifle held tightly in her hands. Tommy was just behind them, his steps heavy, the weight of the fear and confusion etched into his young face. As they neared the edge of the hollow, David suddenly stopped, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the darkening woods. "Wait," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maggie turned to him, a sense of unease creeping up her spine. "What is it?" David didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted, flicking between the trees, as if he were searching for something just beyond their sight. "I feel it," he muttered, his voice strained. "It's not over. It's never over." Maggie's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" David stepped forward cautiously, his eyes fixed on the trees. "It's coming. The land, it doesn't let its victims leave. It takes them, yes, but it also keeps them. And once you enter the hollow, you're marked. Jonah, the others, this land doesn't let them go." Maggie felt a sudden, sharp jolt of fear, a visceral panic that surged through her veins. It was as though the forest was closing in on them, the shadows twisting and shifting with unseen movement. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches creaking ominously in the wind. And then, in the distance, they heard it again, the howl. But this time it was closer, much closer. Maggie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if something was lurking just beyond the edge of their vision, watching them, waiting. David turned to them quickly. "We need to move. Now." Before anyone could react, there was a sudden movement from the trees, fast, too fast. A shape, dark and indistinct, darted between the trunks, a flash of something that sent a jolt of fear through Maggie's entire body. She couldn't make out what it was, but she knew one thing: it wasn't human. "Eliza, Tommy, stay close," Maggie shouted, her voice sharp with panic. She grabbed Eliza's hand and pulled her forward, urging Tommy to stay behind them. David took the lead, his steps quick and purposeful as he guided them back toward the clearing. The howl rang out again, louder this time, a terrifying, inhuman sound that shook the very air around them. It wasn't an animal's cry, but something older, something ancient, something that had waited in the darkness of the forest for far too long. The group picked up speed, their footsteps growing more frantic as the trees seemed to press in on them, the woods narrowing with each passing step. The air was thick with dread, and Maggie could hear her own breath coming in ragged gasps as they pushed through the underbrush, desperate to escape. Then, as they reached the edge of the forest, Maggie felt a sharp tug on her arm. She turned to see Eliza, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Mom, look." Maggie turned and followed her daughter's gaze, her heart sinking as she saw it, standing at the edge of the trees just beyond the clearing. The figure. It was barely visible, a dark shape that blended into the shadows. But there was no mistaking the silhouette, a tall, gaunt figure with elongated limbs, its features obscured by the darkness. It was watching them, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The wind howled again and the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, toward them. "Eliza, run," Maggie shouted, but it was too late. Before they could react, the figure stepped out of the shadows and into the clearing, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she felt a wave of cold wash over her. "Mom," Eliza whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "What is that?" David stepped forward, his face pale with fear. "It's one of them. It's one of the lost souls." The figure took a step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it were more shadow than flesh. Maggie felt a scream building in her chest, but it was as though the air had been sucked out of her lungs. The figure's mouth opened, but no sound came. Instead, there was a shifting in the air, a distortion like a ripple across the surface of water. And then, with a sudden, terrifying speed, it lunged toward them. But before it could reach them, the ground beneath their feet shook violently, and the earth split open with a deafening crack. The figure vanished into the dark chasm that had opened in the earth, its form swallowed up by the abyss. Maggie, Eliza, Tommy, and David stumbled back, the terror of the moment leaving them breathless. The forest was silent again, but the sense of something watching them, waiting for them, remained. Maggie looked down at her children, their faces pale with fear, and knew that this was only the beginning. Whatever had taken Jonah, whatever had claimed the souls of the lost families before them, was not finished. The land had its grip on them and it wasn't letting go. The darkness of the forest swallowed the group whole. As the last echo of the earth-shattering crack faded into the oppressive silence, the heavy, suffocating weight of the moment began to settle over them. The figure, the ghastly, twisted shape that had appeared at the edge of the hollow, was gone, swallowed by the very land that had taken so much from them. But its presence lingered in the air like an invisible poison, poisoning their thoughts, their hearts. Maggie stood frozen for a moment, her body shaking with the cold that had seeped into her bones. Her mind was spinning, unable to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. The ground had split open, the earth itself tearing as though it had been waiting for them to uncover its terrible secret. The figure, the lost soul of the mountain, had been real, a manifestation of something ancient and powerful, something that had taken Jonah and countless others before him. The howling wind that had plagued them seemed to subside now, but the chill it carried lingered in the air. Maggie's breath came in ragged gasps as she forced herself to turn toward her children. Eliza was trembling, her face pale and drawn, eyes wide with the terror of the unknown. Tommy, too, was silent, his small hands shaking as he clutched tightly to his mother's side. We need to leave," Eliza whispered, her voice shaking. Her gaze flickered to the spot where the figure had vanished, as if expecting it to reappear at any moment. "Mom, what is this? What is happening?" Maggie closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. She had always believed in the strength of her family, the strength of her land, but now that belief was unraveling. The mountain had never been just a place. It had been a keeper of something ancient, something forgotten. And it wasn't just Jonah who was lost. The mountain had claimed far more than it should have. Jonah, the lost souls, the figures in the shadows, they were all part of the same dark story. A story that was older than she could comprehend. "We have to go back," Maggie finally said, her voice strained but firm. "We have to go home. This place is cursed. It's not just the land, it's something else." something we don't understand. David, who had remained eerily quiet during the entire exchange, looked down at the ground, his face tight with suppressed emotion. "I never thought it would come to this," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I grew up with these stories. I've heard them all my life, but I never believed it. Not until now." Maggie turned to him sharply. "David, what are you saying? What did you mean when you said the land doesn't let go?" David met her gaze, his expression haunted. "The Hollow is a prison, Maggie. A place where souls are trapped. And Jonah, he's not the first. This place takes people and it doesn't release them. It feeds on them. The land keeps them bound here. And the thing that just attacked us," he hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously toward the trees, "it's one of them. One of the lost souls, waiting for someone to wander too close. It tries to keep you here." Maggie's blood ran cold as she absorbed his words. "You mean, Jonah is still here?" David nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes. He's not gone. Not in the way we think. He's trapped. And he's not the only one. There are others, families who have disappeared into these woods, never to be found. Their souls are bound to the land, unable to leave." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. The mountains were no longer a place of refuge. They were a prison, a dark, ancient force that had been claiming lives for generations, feeding on them, trapping them in a never-ending cycle. Maggie felt a wave of despair flood through her chest, but she fought it down. She could not allow herself to fall apart. Not now. Her family was depending on her. They had to leave the Hollow, but more than that, she had to find a way to free Jonah, to end the curse that had held this land in its grasp for so long. "We can't just leave him here," Maggie said, her voice firm despite the fear that clung to her every word. "We have to do something. We have to end this, for Jonah, for the others. This curse, it's not just going to go away." Eliza looked up at her, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "But how, Mom? How do we stop it? We don't know what we're dealing with. We don't even know how it works." David shifted uneasily, his gaze turning toward the forest again. "There's only one way," he said softly. "We have to find the source. The thing that keeps the souls trapped. The mountain. It's not just the land. There's something older, something beneath it all. And to free Jonah, to free everyone, we need to find what's keeping them here." Maggie's heart hammered in her chest. "What do you mean, find the source? What are you talking about?" David took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the dense woods. "There's a place. A hidden cave deep in the Hollow. It's said to be the heart of the curse. No one who's gone in has ever come back. But if we can reach it, we might be able to break the spell. Set the souls free." Maggie's stomach turned. The idea of venturing deeper into the very place that had taken Jonah, into the heart of the evil that had ensnared him, was terrifying. But what choice did they have? Jonah wasn't just lost to time and space. He was trapped, and unless they acted, he would remain there, a part of the cursed mountain forever. "Let's go," she said, her voice determined despite the fear gnawing at her. "We find this cave. We end this curse." Eliza swallowed hard, her face pale but resolute. "What if it's too late, Mom? What if Jonah? What if we can't bring him back?" Maggie reached out, pulling her daughter close. "I don't know, Eliza, but I have to try. For Jonah. For all of us. We can't let the mountain win." With that, they set off once more, their steps quickening as they moved deeper into the heart of the Hollow. The trees closed in around them, the darkness thickening as the sun began to set. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves, carrying with it an unsettling whisper, as though the forest itself was speaking in a language only it understood. The path ahead was unclear. There was no way to know what waited for them, what horrors lurked in the heart of the Hollow. But Maggie's resolve was unshakable. She would do whatever it took to find Jonah, to free him, to break the curse. For the first time since Jonah had gone missing, Maggie felt a flicker of hope, a faint, fragile thread that seemed to stretch out before her, leading her toward something greater than fear, greater than the terror that had haunted their every step. They had come too far to turn back now. The Hollow has claimed its victims, its grip tightening with each passing year, weaving a dark history of disappearances and forgotten souls. Jonah Harrison, like so many before him, was lost to the mountain, trapped within its ancient, cursed boundaries. But the truth is, the mountain is not just a place of land and trees, it is a living, breathing entity, a keeper of secrets too terrible to bear. And as we stood at the edge of its heart, peering into the abyss that had taken Jonah and countless others, one thing became clear: the curse doesn't end, it doesn't stop. It waits for those brave, or foolish, enough to uncover its depths. Jonah's disappearance was only the beginning, and for his family, for all of us, the mountain's hold is far from over. But even as the shadows closed in, we fought back. We found the truth, the source of the curse that had bound this land for centuries. And in that truth there's hope, not just for Jonah but for all the souls lost to the Hollow. The battle isn't over. The mountain still watches, still waits, but now we know its secrets. and the next time it claims someone will be ready. What if you were the next to disappear into the depths of the mountain? What if the truth was out there waiting for you to uncover it? Share your thoughts. Do you think the curse of the hollow can ever truly be broken? Leave a comment below with your theories, hit the like button if you're ready to uncover more, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales from the darkest corners of the world. Join the journey because the truth is still waiting to be uncovered, and you won't want to miss what's next.